Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the programme. We've been talking about justice, injustice, the impacts on people, on everyday people, on us as societies to these kind of injustices, and how we might respond to problems in our society, how might we respond as individuals but also groups to claim justice. So today I want to talk about something I guess that's really obvious but a little bit more complicated when we start thinking about it. And that is, what does justice actually look like? When we organise to claim justice, when we lobby politicians, when we raise awareness and educate about particular forms of injustice, what is the ultimate goal? Of course we want injustice to stop, but how do we claim reparation for those problems? How do we make ourselves feel that justice has been done? When we think about the traditional Islamic framework, there are a number of debates about what justice is. And it can often be expressed through a kind of balance between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So that as Muslims, as believers, we know that Allah is the ultimate adjudicator. He is the one that will judge us in this life and in the next, and that justice will be done. But beyond that ultimate justice, we have as human beings to sort out what goes on, and as how we deal with victims of injustice and how we deal with perpetrators of injustice. And of course there are a number of laws which are applicable at different times within our societies. So under the early caliphate we have the various forms of physical punishment within the Islamic system. But that those forms of physical punishment are not necessarily able to be implemented in today's societies, or are not particularly suitable. So we see, for example, certain forms of Islamic punishment, even under the Caliph Umar radiallahu an, being not abrogated but paused. So the actual situation and the context we find ourselves shapes to what extent we see forms of justice and forms of punishment being meted out. So there's this kind of legal sense. In our current contemporary societies, the use of prison is often something that we see as a form of getting retribution. So putting people away, removing them from society, not only protects society from that individual, but the argument is said that it punishes that individual by taking away their freedom. So we have this idea that of punishment as a way of making a victim reach a form of closure, of reaching a form of justice. What's interesting about that is that for some victims, the punishment or imprisonment of the perpetrator may or may not fulfill something within them. Of course, we all have, and particularly when we talk about emotional issues, have a sense of revenge, and we have a sense that justice is done when a person who has perpetrated a crime is punished in a way that makes us feel like they have got what they deserve. So as a parent, for example, the thought of my child or any child being victimised brings out a sense of revenge in me that is extremely powerful, but that is also quite disturbing in that the levels of punishment that I would personally like to see on some people is well beyond that of any sort of legislation and law. So the fact that we have systems of law rather than retribution of the person, of the population, of vigilante groups is of course something good, because what we feel as emotionally involved members of the public, of the population, of communities, is not something that is necessarily befitting of us as societies. And we see plenty of examples in places where local laws, community laws are meted out and are actually forms of injustice. So extreme examples where in some tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, victims of rape are punished, or that the the sisters or daughters of male criminals, or people who are considered to be criminals, their daughters or sisters are punished, sexually abused, or gang raped as a punishment to the man. So when we come to our sense of justice as individuals, what we understand to be just and what another person understands to be just can be very different. So what is acceptable to us can change considerably depending on our context and our perspective, and whether an injustice has happened to us or someone that we are emotionally involved with, a family member, or whether we can be, take a step back and be objective about what is healthy as a society and what justice might look like. There's also the interesting phenomenon of the continued perpetration of injustices. Now that could be, for example, that an individual as a young person, as a child, or as an adult, has experienced victimization themselves and then goes on to perhaps perpetrate other forms of crime. So we have people who come from very difficult backgrounds, who have experienced a whole range of challenges that shapes their path and influences their life choices, that goes down a path that they themselves start to commit crimes or perpetrate an injustice against other people. We see this on a national level, for example. We see people, countries, nations who themselves have faced injustice committing those very acts again, those atrocities on other people. And we see it on an individual level. So when it comes to punishment, are we punishing an individual who themselves is a victim? So we can see perpetrators as victims as well. And what we see as a correct justice can therefore be influenced by this idea. So putting someone away in jail who perhaps, for example, I go into prisons sometimes, and particularly women's prisons, which are full of people who haven't really committed high levels of physical violence, but may have committed crimes related to drug abuse, crimes relating to sex work, crimes related to all sorts of things that stem from their own vulnerabilities. And being in prison hasn't healed those wounds, hasn't addressed the victimization that they themselves may have felt, as well as those affected by them. And it doesn't necessarily address future behaviours. So punishing someone is not necessarily rehabilitating them. So although we might have a way of feeling that justice has been done, that we feel better that that person has suffered like their victim has suffered, we don't always look at the future. We don't look at the way that that person, providing we haven't got the death penalty and actually removed them completely by killing them, what is that person going to do? Are they going to become better people? Are they able to be supported to address some of their behaviour? Or are we going to either lock them away and throw the key, or once they return to society, are the very issues that they experienced, the very situations they found themselves in, going to repeat again? And we have the cycle again and again. Within Western Europe, for example, very high instances of reoffending. So the UK sees those who have been released from prison as perpetrators of crime, and in many cases victims of crime as well, reoffending and going back through the system, creating more victims, being victims themselves, and causing an awful lot of heartache, trouble and economic costs in that cycle of what is ultimately injustice, what is achieved by that. And what's interesting about our normative conceptualizations of justice is it usually involves the state. So the state is more broadly in charge of the security services, the police, the judges and the prisons, and therefore the victim is often taken out of the system. So we have somebody who's committed a form of injustice, a crime, something that has a victim involved. And then they are taken through this system in which people who were not involved with that crime, who were not feeling the impact of that crime, are the ones who become in charge of it. So the police officers doing the arresting, the judges who themselves are not the victims or necessarily even understand the kind of victimisation, who try and understand what's happened and promote a kind of punishment that they see fit. So that's a kind of very traditional state-driven form of justice, which underpins all of our societies, all of our nation states, that idea of an internal state criminal justice system. So when we see the victim who is often themselves victimised by that system, rape victims, for example, being made to relive their trauma in a courtroom, not only in front of the person who perpetrated the act, but in front of other people who may be judging them harshly, who they may feel embarrassed about talking to. So often that system in itself is unjust to the victim, but it also keeps the victim away from the offender. And the offender, the person who has perpetrated the injustice, is often not really taking responsibility for that which they have done in the first place. They don't have to apologise to the victim. They don't have to even face or look into the eyes of the victim. Rather, they are taken through the system which removes the person who's faced injustice from that. So that's quite an interesting impact that has, again, on those who are facing injustice, but also about what we really mean about retribution, punishment, and ultimately how we redress the imbalance, how we gain justice. If we think of the scales of justice, it's about getting that balance. Are we really achieving that balance as societies, but also as communities, in how we're understanding what we want, what we feel is the good thing to do? So what I'm interested is something that's called restorative justice. And we see this within the Islamic framework, and we see it happening also in some of our nation states, where the problems of the state official punishment systems are not really creating a healthy environment, are not making victims feel better, but also not stopping the crimes from happening in the first place. So preventative forms of justice and restorative forms of justice. So I'll be talking about those after the break. So please join me then, and thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about justice and how we try and conceptualize it. What does it look like to us? When all too often the traditional state forms of justice involve taking the victim out of the process, taking an offender or a perpetrator of injustice or crime through a system of punishment, often imprisonment or physical punishment, that ultimately doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't stop it doesn't make the victim necessarily feel any better. It doesn't change the attitudes of the oppressor. It doesn't change the attitudes of the perpetrator, and in fact is often responsible for the further injustices and perpetration as that individual or group of people come in and out of prisons. And I mentioned the term restorative justice and how that has a tradition within it that is very compatible with the Islamic framework. And actually, if we have a look at the work of criminologists, is seen to be a much more effective way of achieving justice, of understanding what justice might be. And at the heart of restorative justice is the idea that victims themselves are involved in the process. So if all of us who have felt forms of victimization, forms of crime, forms of injustice, think about, what it is that makes us feel better, what makes us feel empowered. And that is often being involved in the process, being able to survive in the form of facing the perpetrator, facing that person who committed an injustice and getting them to understand what it is that they have done. So restorative justice is an interesting way of looking at it. It's about getting the victim empowered, not this passive person whose situation is overtaken by the state or official people, but who is actively involved in talking about what's happened to them, and in getting that person who has perpetrated the injustice to take responsibility. Now, restorative justice is often seen as something a recent model, something that is progressive, that is seen as often emanating from the Nordic countries, for example, as leaders of this kind of model. What's interesting is that actually within our communities for eons and eons we've had forms of restorative justice, not mob rule, which is different, but the idea, for example, of in Pakistan and the Indian subcontinent and Afghanistan, forms of panchayat, which is a Punjabi word, but basically where you have local community leaders, local community representatives coming together and talking about a particular crime, talking about it with the victim and with the perpetrator, and coming to some sort of sense of agreement about what it is that that the victim has experienced, so that all of the community understands what's happened, and what the perpetrator needs to do to address it, whether that's the traditional punishments that we have within our states, or whether it's the actual recognition of the problem in the first place and what that person is going to do about it. So this idea of sitting around, a more human approach to justice, a more community-based approach to justice, not meaning, as I say, mob rule, but where the victim is involved, where the perpetrator is made to feel part of the community, not just part of a broader, detached criminal justice system, has very profound effects, and I think is definitely supported by the spirit of the Islamic framework. For example, most victims, statistically, whom criminologists have talked to, have interviewed, and have done extensive research, want to feel empowered, want to meet the offender. And what's interesting about this process is that the symptoms of victimization that we've spoken about in previous episodes, the emotional impact, the physical impact, the psychological problems, post-traumatic stress disorder, fear, those feelings are often greatly reduced, because the fear of the person, the fear of the perpetrator, when the victim has power over that person, when the victim is able to meet them, to tell them in a situation where they're not being victimized anymore, when the injustice is not being done to them, when they are able to express their situation and what the offender has done to them, this is very, not only empowering, but can have very positive effects on the psychological and physical health of somebody who has faced injustice. And what's interesting about this model, not only is it more human, but it has a more profound effect, not just on two people, but on communities. And that's why it's been very useful in situations of conflict. Because if we get away from this model of perpetration and punishment and talk about the way that conflict can be transformed, that the hearts of people don't necessarily need to be perpetrated into this constant stream of hatred, that the victim hates the offender, that the offender hated in the first place, and that this is going to continue with the state punishing that person. If we can transform conflict so that the victim feels that they are achieving justice but is able to express their situation, and that the offender takes responsibility, but also that that person can be rehabilitated back into our communities. And we see how effective it is in conflict areas. So in places where great atrocities have happened, and we can think of many examples, if we think about the civil violence that we have had in the past, whether it's Rwanda, Bosnia, and currently in the Middle East, we see the huge levels of victims within Syria, not only victims of state violence, but when we see victimization happening by our own neighbours, we see victimization and injustice being perpetrated by even members of our own families or broader communities or society. The disturbing nature of that is that those perpetrators are likely to be there always. So in Rwanda, for example, after the terrible killings and slaughtering and conflict, people who have survived are often then living side by side as victims and perpetrators of an injustice. And this not only is necessarily happening in cases of war, but in all of our cases, there are people who have come out of prisons or who might have victimised us, not in a criminal sense, but in a bullying sense, for example, who we have to live with. So the question is how we move on from that, how we might live together in that situation. I have colleagues who do research around torture, for example, and what's very disturbing about the use of torture is that not only does the victim face the initial horrendous pain and distress that torture is intended to inflict on its victim, but the fact that there's a human being, and often a person, you know, from a community or a city in which you belong, is doing that action. And that when years down the line you see that person in the street who did that to you, you know, how do you move on from that? So the notion of justice beyond revenge and beyond state punishment is how we might live as human beings, how we might restore the balance within our communities. So I've talked about the very different examples of how injustice can be addressed. Not only the extreme forces of injustice where we have forms of torture and violence and murder in war situations and situations of civil conflict, but also in terms of the everyday injustices that we may face in our families and our communities. And I've previously talked about the victimisation of children relating to our sense of discipline and of guiding young people towards good living or the straight path. But that sometimes we misguidedly punish young people and punish children in ways that are ultimately damaging. But when we talk about justice and trying to instill a sense of justice, this can be helpful on this kind of basis of youth and adult and guiding youth towards behaving and taking responsibility. And again, there are some really interesting examples within our communities that are being promoted by our local institutions. So that might be within mosques or certain community groups who are not taking the law into their own hands, but who have decided to contribute to interventions with young people who may be both victims and perpetrators of crime and injustice. So, where there are areas of gang crime, young people affiliating themselves to particular gangs and fighting with each other and getting involved in all sorts of criminal activities, and ultimately being extremely self-destructive as well as destructive of their local communities and the people in opposing gangs. We have instances of intervention work where community members who have the skills, who have the knowledge and who have the passion and determination to change these are able to go into communities, to go into gangs and say, you know, what is going on? We're going to be doing some intervention work. Tell me what you're involved in. Tell me how we can support you to stop this behaviour, to desist from these actions. So again, not necessarily about punishing those individuals, but sitting down and seeing what we can do about it, how we can make the situations of the perpetrators of injustice as well as their victims. Sitting around looking at how they're making other people feel can be very powerful, but also listening to them about how they feel and why they're doing it to those people may be also extremely useful and has longer term impacts. if we can prevent people or intervene in that path of violence or that path of abuse or that path of injustice, we can often prevent more victims, and we can also prevent that perpetrator from carrying on those activities. So youth courts, youth forums in which victims and perpetrators of particular crimes, particularly among young people, can be addressed, is something that's innovative, is not necessarily thought about within that state framework, but can be much more effective because it's at the grassroots, and because those who are able to do this work are so well connected and understand the context and understand the people involved in a way that a police officer or a judge, an older elite judge might not be able to comprehend. So within this programme, I've hopefully explored some of the pertinent issues to trying to make us think about, the relationship between a victim of injustice and the perpetrator, and that relationship can be complex. Not only is a perpetrator someone who commits an act of injustice, but also may be a victim in their own way and have experienced forms of victimization that continues this cycle of violence. So what I'm so interested in is this stopping the cycle of violence, stopping the cycle of injustice, in which we then punish the perpetrator, but don't really stop the behaviour and don't really address the needs of the victim, because the needs of the victim, beyond seeing a punishment, are not necessarily being addressed. And empowering the victim in order to speak about what's happened to them, not only to broader society, but also to the perpetrator, can be so helpful. And the interventions that we can have before forms of victimization get too far, if we can do preventative work, if we can sit down with people who are beginning to commit injustices, who are getting involved in criminal activities, in negative behaviours, wayward youth who are getting involved in things that might not be criminal, but are going to allow them to much more easily lose their moral compass, lose their sense of self, be sucked into bad behaviours. If we can address them in a much more humane, justice-orientated, restorative sense, this is something that we see actually works and is much more satisfactory for all involved, and makes us better communities, makes us better people and societies. So I hope that's been interesting, and please join me next time. Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum.